Hello and welcome to our webinar called Minding Our Own Business, how to ensure Canadian businesses respect human rights abroad. I see people are joining quite quickly, so we'll give you a moment just to get on and make sure your sound is working before we formally begin. We really want to welcome all of you from across the country to this webinar. And we were really impressed by the number of people that confirmed. And so we're expecting several hundred people this evening. And this webinar is presented by the CNCA and its members, so the Canadian Network for Corporate Accountability. And many of CNCA's members have grassroots constituencies, so including the United Church, Development and Peace, Amnesty International, and so many other organizations. And so we're really glad to be able to come together as members of these organizations across the country to talk about how Canada can ensure that our businesses respect human rights abroad. So I think I'll begin by acknowledging the land that that I am on here. It's the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk people, and it's also known as Montreal. And Montreal is a place that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among many different nations, and it continues to be like that to this day. If you're having any technical issues, we invite you to type in the chat, and actually I should take a look at the chat, just to mention if you need any help. We do have technical support on the call or on the webinar who will be able to help you out. And we encourage you to actually, if you have questions, to use the Q&A function, so you can type in your question, and we hope to be able to answer all of the questions, either out loud or in the chat by writing the questions in case we're short on time. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll ensure that all of the people who registered for the webinar will get a link to the recording of the webinar, as well as all the resources that we'll be sharing this evening. To begin, we want to learn a little bit more about you. And so we have a little survey that we'll share, and we'll invite you to answer these 3 questions. And it's a poll. I don't know if you've participated in these before on Zoom. And so I'll invite, oh yeah, here we go. So please go ahead and take your time answering the questions. Some of you are having a little problem with the with answering the survey. Hopefully you'll be able to scroll through and answer and press submit, but if not, it's not the end of the world. We can see that still a good proportion of participants have been able to answer. And just be sure to answer all the questions in order to be able to submit. It's compulsory to answer all 3 questions in order to submit your questions. Yeah, it's still, people are still answering, so maybe we'll give it another few seconds. Okay, I think we have a really good picture of who's on our webinar tonight, so we could close the poll and share the results. So we see that the entire country is represented this evening, with, of course, you know, many from Ontario, because you're the majority of the population, but it's nice to see that all provinces and territories are represented. We also have a wide variety of people with experience, some with a quarter with more than 10 years, another quarter 5 to 10 years, another quarter 1 to 5 years, and we have 25% newbies who are just new to this issue, and we really are excited about that, and we're going to have a lot to be able to share with you tonight. And then, of course, for the organizations that you're associated with, also a wonderful diversity of members of the CNCA. It's fantastic to see how many people are here and who are active with all of these different, you know, churches, unions, NGOs, and other organizations. I really am very, very happy now to be able to present Emily Dwyer, who will kick off our webinar tonight. She's the coordinator of the Canadian Network for Corporate Accountability, the CNCA. She has a law degree from Dalhousie University and has been working on business and human rights for over 10 years now. So she will go ahead and share her screen and begin her presentation.
Good evening, everyone. It will just take me a minute to share my screen here. And that should be, okay, there we go. There's a little lag behind. Perfect. So thank you for the introduction, Elena. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Someone asked about how many people were on here tonight. I will have to look at the numbers again. We had over 400 registered for this evening, and over 100 registered for the French webinar we had earlier today. So there is evidently quite a lot of interest. Many of you are from member organizations of the CNCA, and included within there are human rights organizations, faith-based organizations, feminist and international development, labor unions, etc., many of whom have really long-standing relationships with global partners around the world who are directly impacted by the operations of Canadian companies and those who are making goods for the Canadian market. We work together, this 38 members and all of our grassroots members, including all of you, towards advancing a business and human rights vision. So one where we're trying to contribute to a world that's free from discrimination, harassment, intimidation, and violence, and environmental destruction. We are seeking to have respect for human rights and the environment by Canadian companies operating overseas throughout their global operations and supply chains, and for Canadian laws and policies to uphold rights for people and rules for business. Another way of saying that we're looking for there to be coherence between Canadian law and policy and our international human rights obligations. Why we prioritize corporate accountability in particular is because there is widespread harm linked to corporate activity. Those who are defending their rights against corporate abuse are often the most vulnerable, the most at risk for abuses. There is a global accountability gap where international systems that we have in place do not are not set up to hold companies accountable internationally, in both in terms of the host states where companies operate, and here in Canada, our legal systems fail to adequately protect those who are harmed by overseas corporate conduct. Canada and Canadians have a particular responsibility and the particular linkages. In terms of Canadian, Canada is home to over 60% of Canadian mining, oil and gas companies. Canadian mining companies around the world are Canadian. And there's also a lot of other links. The clothes that we wear, the computers and phones that we use, etc., are made by overseas corporate activity often. And the other important linkage is around our global, our long-term relationships. Many of our members are partners with people who are directly impacted. So in many ways, the impacts of Canadian companies' operations is not some distant statistic, but something that's impacting our colleagues and friends, and one of the things that motivates us to act. I wanted to mention quickly that I'm going to be talking about two of our really important priorities, the creation of an independent ombudsperson with power to investigate and mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. But those are two elements of a broader business and human rights agenda that we have. There's not a single measure that will do enough to ensure the rights for people and rules for business. We're looking at a broad framework, but working towards the most urgent and priority strategic advances right there. So some of the other things that we're looking for in our longer term vision are up there, including the prioritization of free, prior, and informed consent throughout all of those other measures. So I wanted to quickly give an update on the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, because I know that many of you have been with us in this campaign over the years. The essential elements of an effective ombudsperson's office are that it's independent, it has power to investigate, it's oriented around the advancement of human rights, it reports publicly, it makes recommendations around remedy and prevention of harm, both around prevention of harm by changes in corporate policy and prevention of harm through Canadian law and policy reform. And the ombudsperson should be empowered to undertake monitoring and follow-up. In Canada, our campaign for the ombudsperson has been a decade-long public education and campaigning activity that our various member organizations have been working on, and all of you have been, or many of you have been active on for quite a while. That led to, in January 2018, a huge success. The Government of Canada announced the creation of the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise and committed to all of the essential elements that I mentioned in the previous slide. So they announced that they were taking real action to create a real effective ombudsperson. Then, almost immediately after, there was a significant pushback by industry. There was foot dragging, and in April of 2019, the government backtracked on this promise. It gutted the office, Instead of announcing an independent office with powers to investigate, it announced the hiring, the nomination of Sherry Meyerhofer as the first ombudsperson, and the office did not have the power to investigate needed, including things like the power to compel documents and testimony. In September 2019, Minister Carr wrote to the CNCA and some of our member organizations, reiterating the government's commitment to ensuring that the Ombudsperson's Office had powers to investigate, and committed to doing so in the future through legislation. Since the elections, there has been no action by the government. The Corps still does not have the powers it needs. It's still not independent, and the office is not open to receive complaints. We haven't waited silently. We haven't sat back while the government turned around. Many of you have been involved. There were marches in Toronto, social media campaigns, petitions, and public media stunts, UN speakers coming to parliamentary symposiums. So thank you for everything that you have done to help keep attention on this, to not allow this backslide to be ignored. When we learned that the Canadian Ombudsperson's Office was going to be traveling to South America in March of 2020, we issued a caution to our global partners that the Corps is not the office that we asked for, that we celebrated, or that we were promised. And if you'd like to look at that advisory, it's on our website. The other major ask of our current campaigning is comprehensive mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. So this is legislation that seeks to prevent and eliminate adverse human rights impacts in the global operations and supply chains of companies based in Canada and or doing business in Canada. There are lots of reasons to feel optimistic about this kind of legislation that would complement the Ombudsperson's Office. There's a huge international momentum right now, especially in Europe, where laws such as this are coming up, which means we're not asking Canada to be a leader, we're asking it to catch up to what's happening around the world. Civil society is developing a detailed proposal. There's cross-partisan interest. There are some challenges where the government consultations around supply chain legislation have not been announced, a second phase of them. There's a Senate bill on modern slavery, which really misses the mark, which is really inadequate, that's out there. And there's some question about how to advance this kind of legislation in the context where government is understandably quite focused on the pandemic. As this is something that we haven't spoken about with many of you before, I thought I would highlight some of the essential elements of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. So it needs to articulate that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights throughout their supply chains and global operations, to require companies to undertake due diligence, which includes identifying, preventing, mitigating, and accounting for human rights and environmental impacts. It should apply throughout the company's entire corporate structure, business relationships like security guards, factory suppliers, etc., throughout their global operations and supply chains. It should also cover the full complement of internationally recognized human rights. It is so much work to get business and human rights legislation passed in Canada. It needs to be something robust. It can't focus on a single rights issue. And it also, very importantly, needs to provide for liability and remedy if a company fails to exercise appropriate due diligence and causes harm. So it can't just be a law requiring reporting. It really needs to be a law requiring action by companies to prevent harm and to be able to hold them accountable if they fail to do so. It is my pleasure to introduce for a short intervention now Kathryn Anderson, who will speak to us a bit about grassroots organizing for Member of Parliament engagement from the Maritimes. Kathryn has been involved with the Maritimes Guatemala Breaking the Silence Network for many years, United for Mining Justice, and I just anecdotally, many times when I would meet with members of Parliament from the Maritimes at various events that we would hold, they would always ask me to please tell Kathryn Anderson that I had received their call, that I had met with them, because they were, that is how effective of an advocate Kathryn is. So thank you very much, Kathryn. I'll pass it over to you.
Well, I'm going to speak not just about me though, but really about primarily two organizations, the Maritimes Guatemala Breaking the Silence Network and a little committee of the United Church Justice Network here in the Maritimes called Mining the Connections. But we've also had very significant connections with Amnesty International and Kairos and Development and Peace. But Emily asked me particularly to speak about how do we have the stamina to be involved for well over 10 years actually now, and meeting with MPs. And I would say that really has, well, first of all, there is a bit of history, so that if you're in Prince Edward Island, you can meet with your MP, really anyone could. That's just the history of Canada. But even there, I think it's been very significant to build relationships over time. And for example, in around 2008, 2009, in second reading of the bill that ultimately got defeated but came very close, Jim Wicks, a member of Breaking the Silence and the United Church in Prince Edward Island, had Wayne Easter's personal phone number and was able to call him on the way to the afternoon question period, and he changed his vote. And so I think that it is that level of coming to know your MPs and encouraging people to do that. But really behind it, I would say that the reason that really a lot of us in the Maritimes have been able to meet with our MPs, apart from the kind of maritime history and accessibility with MPs, most particularly on Prince Edward Island, I'm from Nova Scotia, but is to do with the fact of long-term education that involves bringing partners to the Maritimes every year who've been affected by mining justice. We have been doing that now since 2004, almost every year. There have been tours in the Maritimes. And once you meet someone like Sister Maudelia from San Miguel Ixtahuacan, where the Goldcorp mine was, or Angelica Choc in Ellazar in the eastern part, it is very hard to kind of just say, well, we can't be bothered, or it's not worth it. It then motivates us, I think, to keep in touch with our MPs, to build the relationships, which isn't to say that we discern which MPs are worth visiting. I think it's fair to say that the MP for this area during the Harper area, who was a Tory MP, we went to visit him once and we would not have gone again. And so there is some discernment. But it is that grassroots education all year round that I think finally brings people to say, I am willing to go to my MP. I would say then, and it's real cooperation, as I was saying, for example, in our area and further east in Antigonish, the work of the Amnesty International rep has been very important in being willing to relate with our work and with both in Breaking the Silence, which is a secular network, and the church network. But I think it is the continual campaign of education and also action all along so that people know what's happening. And it also, the other thing is building up confidence. And it is, I think, a continual challenge that many of the folks in our networks, and presumably Canadians in general, feel somehow they can't go to see their MP because they don't know as much as the MP. And I think what one has to do is to convince people to go to see their MP. Normally, one visit will help them realize that they're actually educating their MP and that they do know more than they think. But related to that, I think, is always planning ahead. We're quite spread out oftentimes in the rural Maritimes, so it's not that we plan a day or two ahead, but we just go early on the day that we're meeting with an MP, and we talk together, and we hunch what questions they will ask. We make sure what questions we want to, questions and statements we want to get in, and we assign the tasks, and we get together after. And people really, once they've done that, they're not scared to go again. People gain confidence by doing it, I would say. And so I think, you know, those are the major things. I would say, though, that one other maybe small challenge, but it's perhaps worth saying, is that we have found more than once that the staff of MPs are often resistant to us. They tend to say that, well, this isn't a very important issue compared with the constituency issues when their MPs are at home. And so why would they meet with us? There's more important issues that are also maybe what they see as voting issues, and or in the case of our famous MP Bill Casey, trying to protect him. But Bill finally got frustrated because we would say, well, we told you about the meeting, and he'd say, well, my staff never told me. So he finally gave us his own personal email. And I do think that one has to be really persistent with the staff and say, and then they would say often, well, why don't you just have a phone call with them? We'd say, no, we want to meet with him in person. And I'm not speaking only of Bill Casey, but I think just to say that is another challenge that we've had. I think those are the primary things that I would want to say, except to say that I think we've had tremendous involvement of people across all three provinces over these past 10 years. But I think it's going to be a tough challenge to get people overcoming the cynicism that they feel, the disappointment they feel in the government's lack of response around the ombudsperson, and hope that somehow there can be a congruence of opposition parties and maybe backbencher Liberal MPs. Otherwise, I think people are going to say, why bother? We've had 2 rounds of disappointment. That's not maybe the most hopeful ending, but to say, I do believe that people at the grassroots, with continual education and support and meeting partners, either here or overseas, can enable people to feel the confidence to be willing to lobby their MPs.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. So I'm just going to try and share my screen again. Anyways, I will maybe just forget about, I'll figure out my slide in a moment. I was just going to conclude with a little bit of discussion about my own reflections on hope. I think that I can share and feel the concern and cynicism and disappointment about the government's reversals. I think we also all can recognize that this is a long-term struggle with small gains, step backwards, that as much as we haven't created the office that we wanted, we have had some successes. There are things that have materialized in terms of difference. We've changed the narrative. Government has acknowledged that there's a problem with some Canadian companies operating overseas. and that government has a responsibility to ensure that companies overseas are respecting human rights. That's something that didn't exist previously. The discussion now is not whether we need an ombudsperson or other corporate accountability measures, but about how to make them effective. There's also a shifting global context. It's very recent that there have been developments in Europe of really important legislation. So now we're not calling on Canada to be a leader in business and human rights, but at least to be catching up to what's happening around the world. And anecdotally, when our colleagues from France were here speaking about the duty of vigilance law, they highlighted that it was shepherded by 3 members of parliament. And we have 3 MPs on the panel this evening. Also, the context of the pandemic is causing, one of the things that it's causing is discussions about how to not return to business as usual afterwards. I think the last piece that provides me hope or inspiration is also that we owe it to our partners around the world not to be giving up. And we'll be hearing from some of them in just a moment. And many of them have been involved in struggles that involve much more risk for much longer than even we have. And that's something that does continue to motivate me. Lastly, I think that there is a bit of a piece around persistence. There was, I think, a bit of a calculation by government that if they just continued to delay, we might get tired. We might stop asking. We might quiet down. And I think and hope that they've underestimated us, that we won't let them get away with this. I will figure out how to share my screen later to show you a panel that I had with some of our contact information. But now we'll be moving on to 2 short video testimonials. The first of the Mura people of the Brazilian Amazon, who are partners of Development and Peace. Development and Peace will be campaigning on free, prior, and informed consent in support of these partners over the next year. That will be followed by a short video from Kalpona Akter from the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity. They are partners with the Steelworkers Humanity Fund, Oxfam, CLC, and many other members of the CNCA, and will be and is speaking in particular about the impacts of the pandemic on workers there. And then Japhet from the United Church will be introducing our guest from the Philippines. We can go ahead with the video. Thank you.
Nós, como indígena Mura, nós fomos...
For us Mura people who were born and raised here in this village, in this forest, nature means everything to us.
Então ela significa tudo para nós.
We are part of the forest, and it is part of us.
A floresta ela é de nós também.
Em meio a essa floresta, in the middle of the forest, there is a people, there are persons. We survive off the land, we survive off the rivers. The moment our land is explored and our waterways are polluted, we cease to exist. Nós também deixamos de existir.
At the moment, the biggest concern is the territorial issue. A mining company wants to establish itself on our territory to extract minerals.
The mine arrived in the community without explaining its impacts and without consulting us.
The company came to my door saying it was doing research, but they didn't say what the research was about. Then a man from the company told me he was coming to buy my land. I said, but I'm not selling it. I have no intention of selling it. And he said, but you have to sell it because the company needs it. I said, but I'm not selling it. He said, if you don't sell it, you will lose it. With each passing year, with each additional clearing, things get harder.
If it continues like this, our children and our grandchildren will have nothing left.
Que para nossos filhos, para nossos netos, não vai mais existir.
Our duty as the Mura people is to keep vigil. But we who are the guardians of the forest are not respected.
Nós não somos respeitados.
Our rights are violated.
Because of misinformation and lack of information, the Mura perceived the mine as something good, something necessary for the development of the region.
Para o desenvolvimento da região. E aí, nesse sentido,
Then they thought about it until they felt the need to ask for this consultation.
Sentiram a necessidade de pedir essa consulta. A justiça achou por bem que se fizesse acordo.
The court granted that the project should be stopped until the Mura decide what they want.
Have a great impact, both environmentally and socially.
Nós queremos nosso território.
We want our territory. We want the demarcation of our lands and all indigenous lands to make Brazil a country where we can live in harmony and security.
E harmonia e que a gente possa viver com mais segurança dentro desse país.
I don't think we can do it alone. We are going to fight until the end, but we will not succeed because the forces that oppose us are stronger. We really need your support.
Às vezes é com pouco recurso que a gente consegue ir muito longe.
Sometimes with few resources, it is possible to do a lot.
Uma mobilidade, tanto nós.
I always say that this allows for mobility, for us to support the Mura, but also for them to organize themselves to assert their rights.
Mesmo se articular e se mobilizar para conquistar os seus direitos.
If the workers do not die getting infected by this virus, they will die, in hunger. My name is Kalpona Akter. I'm the Executive Director at Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity. Are making them profit for a long time, but now they are not coming and saying that no problem, we are with you. Rather doing that, what they're doing, they're canceling the orders. We are not asking for them to do charity, to give a food bag. We are asking them to pay our workers' wages. The factories or their manufacturers association, they totally can say our workers that we are all together in it and we'll get through together. They haven't said anything. As a business leader, they didn't have our worker back. There is a huge inequality between these Canadian CEO and a factory worker. There is a huge inequality, and this is all this is all we knew, but this has become like very black and white in this pandemic. We are all in this pandemic together, but in many cases the consequences again different. Our workers do not have a food in their home that goes even 1 week. As our consumers, what you can do, you can raise your voice and ask these brand and retailers who is sourcing from our country. They should step up. Just show your humanity at this moment. We need to survive. We need to survive. So please be with us.
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll pass it over to Japhet if you're going to introduce Tinay.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. It's my rare opportunity to introduce to you our next speaker. Tinay or Cristina. And my friend, we are not going to introduce you, or I'm not going to introduce you in the normal way I would if I was in the Philippines. I would not mention everything about you. But Tinay, as we popularly call her, is the Secretary General of Karapatan, which is an alliance of individuals, groups, and organizations working to promote and protect human rights in the Philippines. This is one woman, one lady who has been red tagged, harassed, intimidated, and threatened, all because of standing for human rights and defending human rights for all Filipino people. She's a regional council member, equivalent to a regional board of the Asia Pacific Forum on Women and Law and Development, which is Karapatan's representative on the international coordinating group, including frontline defenders on global campaigns to stop the killing of human rights defenders. Tinay is a graduate of the University of the Philippines, and she has been a facilitator and has been involved in several human rights activities within the Philippines. So over to you, my friend Tinay. You're still muted? Okay, there you are.
Thank you, everyone. Well, as what we have been saying for the past few years in the Philippines, we have been facing one of our worst human rights crisis in history. The past 3 years under our president, can we go please to slide 2, Elena? Thank you. Has resulted in various cases of extrajudicial killings, both of suspected drug users and human rights defenders. There is an increased, there's a spike in the attacks against human rights defenders, including environmental and land rights activists. We are experiencing what I would call the hyper state of impunity, meaning we're beyond the normal, if we call it normal, levels of impunity, one that deals on not merely non-accountability, but excessive repetition of cases of unresolved human rights violations. We are also in the middle of what we call deconstriction, or the closing of civic and democratic space, as well as the continuing sellout of our lands, territories, and resources. Next slide, please. The Global Witness reported last year that the Philippines is the worst place to be for environmental defenders, working with Karapatan and many other partners in the Philippines. Global Witness has documented 30 environmental and land rights defenders killed in 2019 alone. Along with the killings of rights defenders and specifically land and environmental rights defenders are the many forms of attacks against human rights defenders, which you will see in the next slide. The case of people being red tagged, as we called, or tagged as terrorists, the many cases of vilification, threats, and harassment of environmental defenders. And this includes the cases of 2 of our champions at the international level, the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, Victoria Tauli Corpus, and the UN one of the UN environmental champions, Joan Carling, who were included in what we call a target list of environmental and human rights defenders. They faced trumped-up charges of terrorism in 2018, and the threat against them continues to this day. We are also facing at least 500,000 cases of forced evacuation of small farmers, agricultural workers, and indigenous peoples due to counterinsurgency and entry of agribusiness plantations and large-scale mining companies. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, the Philippine government's neoliberal economic policies on mining, agribusiness, and forestry have provided rights to big businesses, taking precedence over the people's rights to ancestral lands, protected areas, and agrarian reform areas. Especially with the implementation of the Mining Act of 1995, it opened many areas and made them vulnerable. Many communities are made vulnerable because of the free flow or liberalized schemes in the mining industry in the country. Next slide, please. This includes the Mining Act of 1995 was spurred by the passage of which was spurred by the Mark Copper mining disaster, as we call it now. Mark Copper is a company owned by Placer Dome, which is based in Canada, and is the biggest and worst mining disaster up to this time in the country, because it has resulted in massive destruction of river systems, including two major rivers, Boak and Mogpog rivers, and it has resulted also to the displacement of thousands of residents and families in a province called Marinduque in the country in 1993 and 1996. I believe criminal cases have been filed against Placer Dome, but to date there has been no substantial resolution of the said case, which is the reason why the Philippine government has continued to provide funds to rehabilitate the river systems affected by the tailing mining spills of Mark Copper. Next slide, please. Also an issue that is being faced here in relation to Canada are issues concerning toxic wastes. And this has made the news because apparently our president sounded tough in demanding the Canadian government to have the toxic wastes repatriated back to Canada when since 2013 or 2014 it has been here. Well, as of last year, only 69 containers out of the 103 shipping containers of toxic waste have been shipped back to Canada. But I think we still have a long way off, in doing more than just shipping back the toxic waste, but in terms of establishing accountability and ensuring that it will not happen again. We'll have to really be a great effort for civil society and communities. Next slide. But so with the COVID pandemic in the country, we are on unprecedented levels because extrajudicial killings continue. On April 1, We had hoped that it was an April Fool's joke, but it is no joke when the president, the highest public official in the country, would publicly declare that those who would go out of their homes should be shot dead. And true enough, a couple of weeks after, an environmental defender in Iloilo has been killed, supposedly by unidentified men. Jory Porquia, who's a good friend who has been working on environmental issues and concerns for so many decades, has been killed last April 30. And to date, there's been no investigation being done on his case. Next slide, please. Many have been arrested because of alleged quarantine violations, including the homeless, including relief workers, like Jory, who was conducting food or relief aid before he was killed. Many experienced torture and cruel and inhuman treatment, such as being caged in, being put in dog cages or being put in coffins to teach them, to supposedly teach them a lesson. Next slide, please. We are also, we also have low mass testing levels for COVID-19 as anywhere else in the world, I think, or especially in this part of the world in Asia. There is a low priority for public health facilities and services. Many of our doctors have been failed by the COVID pandemic because of lack of protection. Next slide. And political prisoners, including environmental and land rights defenders like Indigenous Peoples leader Jomorito Guainon and a nursing mother Cora Agovida, remain in jail despite many pleas, public pleas to release political prisoners and other prisoners to decongest jails. We have one of the highest jail congestion levels in the whole world, from ranging from 650% to 1,500% over congestion rates. So literally the prisons in the country are ticking time bomb, because at any time the outbreak strikes inside jail, it would cause really massive loss of human lives. Cases of violent dispersals of picket lines of residents who are protesting against the entry of large-scale mining, like the case of in the province of Nueva Vizcaya, where an Australian mining corporation, OceanaGold, is being called to recall their mining operations. The residents were violently dispersed also during this time of the pandemic. Next slide. So what do we do? And how do we look at the new normal that is being seen during the time when we are facing this pandemic and even after? As we say here, it cannot be business as usual, because business as usual means that we'll have to withstand the unprecedented crisis that we are already facing, that has been intensifying the past few years. And in terms of business and human rights, we think that countries and corporations outside the country should be constantly reminded of their obligations under international rights instruments, particularly on due diligence and extraterritorial obligations. We are asking people to support the call for the release of all political prisoners, including detained land rights and environmental defenders in the Philippines. And we are also talking, I've personally talked to Canadian delegation representatives both here in the Philippines and in Geneva, asking them to support the resolution at the UN Human Rights Council for an independent investigation on the human rights situation in the Philippines, which includes the environmental and land rights situation, including the possible involvement of corporations like the ones based in Canada on human rights violations in the Philippines. So it means that we cannot just go back to the current state, what we are experiencing right now. The challenge is really to push the envelope for more substantial reforms and change in not only Philippine policies with regards to neoliberal policies on mining and other extractive industries, but also at the international level, it is important to continue to uphold human rights amidst the various corporate interests that would tend to undermine it. At the United Nations level, we support the effort to uphold the UN binding treaties for business and human rights, and we really hope that this year a stronger treaty that will enhance our advocacy for similar domestic legislation or instruments will help boost the campaigns against destructive mining in the country, and will uphold people's rights amid various corporate and neoliberal.
We seem to be losing your sound a little bit at the end, Cristina. But thank you so very much for your powerful intervention. Elena, you?
Yes, thank you so much, Tinay, for telling us about the very serious human rights situation in the Philippines and for Canada's responsibility in those issues. And so we can see that in the Philippines, in Bangladesh, in the Brazilian Amazon, these business and human rights issues are urgent, and COVID is actually exacerbating the situation. So it just shows the urgency of the need for an effective ombudsperson and for due diligence legislation. Now I have the pleasure to introduce Fiona Koza, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce her because I'm sure you're all wondering, what can I do? What can I do to take action? Tinay has proposed a few things, but we have a whole strategy for you. And you know, we are persevering. We're not giving up this struggle for an effective ombudsperson, and we are launching our e-petition today for a bill on human rights due diligence legislation, and it's all very exciting. So Fiona Koza is the business and human rights campaigner for Amnesty International Canada. She's based in Vancouver, where she's joining us from today. She's also worked for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the Sierra Club, as well as Greenpeace India, Australia, and the Philippines. So we're really glad to welcome you this evening, Fiona.
Thanks, Elana. Do you hear me fine?
Yes.
Can see my screen? Okay, great. I'm thrilled to be here today to present the action plan for our May month of action. And this is a collaborative effort of all the organizations that belong to the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability. And that is really important because we need thousands of people participating in this. And we've got that among all our, all our various members. member organizations. So it's great that we're all working together on this project. Now, here are some photos from some of the actions we've done over the recent years, and you may remember some of these events, or maybe you may even recognize yourself in some of these pictures. So I'm looking forward to telling you about our action plan for the May month of action and the coming months as well. So our action plan has 4 points. First, signing the petition. Second, joining our social media challenge. Third, meeting your MP, and fourth, joining our virtual rally. And now I'll describe each of these in a little more detail. So our petition is, this time we have a parliamentary petition. This is different than our previous petitions in that it's sponsored by an MP and will be tabled in the House of Commons in September. We need thousands of people signing this. So we're hoping that you will all get your friends to sign this petition. Of course, we can't do it in person, but this is an electronic petition. The petition says that we're calling, let's see, just a second. Here's when you go to the website, let me see if I can, here's the link for the petition. It's a bit.ly short link so bit.ly/empower and enact. And it says empower and enact because we're asking for the ombudsperson to be empowered and for the government to enact human rights due diligence legislation. So when you go to that link, you will get this petition. And it calls on the House of Commons to take concrete measures to strengthen rules for businesses and uphold human rights, including, and these are the 2 key asks of the petition. 1, empowering the ombudsperson with independence and the power to investigate human rights abuse allegations. And number 2, enacting a comprehensive human rights due diligence law that compels businesses to respect the most current international human rights standards across the entirety of their global operations and supply chains and holds them liable for harms caused by or on behalf of their operations. So once you have signed that petition, then we encourage you to take our social media challenge. And that information is found at this link in the bottom left corner. So whether you use Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, you can participate. When you go to this link, which maybe one of my colleagues could share in the chat, or we will also send it in an email to all participants after the webinar. When you click on this link, what you'll get is a list of suggested posts that you can post to Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, saying something like, you know, this is the problem and this is why I signed the petition. And well, you'll see just a sec. There's 3 actions within our social media challenge. So signing the petition and challenging and tagging your friend. So once you post it to social media, it will say like, join me signing this petition. I'm calling on you. And then you tag your friends, Bob, Carol, Frank, tag them in your social media post so that they see it and you challenge them to sign the petition and share it as well. So all of that, along with graphics and suggested text that you can include, is in this link in the bottom corner. The second action is to tweet your member of parliament. So the member of parliament, you're saying, there are also sample tweets in this link that tells you what you could say as calling for a meeting and asking them to support the petition and why this is an important issue to you. And then the third action point, share it again on social media. We're not letting this go. We've got more suggested Facebook posts you can do. Now in this document, it also tells you the dates. So action 1 starts today and goes for, I think, 6 days. This is signing the e-petition and challenging your friends and tagging them. Then there's dates for the next action. That's next week, tweeting your MP, and so on. So all the information is there in this document. I mentioned that there's some images that you can post to your social media feed along with the text about the petition. And so here are some of the images that are provided. So a link to these images are also provided in this Google document so that all the images are shared so you have everything you need to do a social media challenge. Then the next point, so there's signing the e-petition, then there's a social media challenge, and the third thing that you can do is meetings with MPs. How are you going to meet with your MP during the pandemic? MPs are meeting with their constituents by phone or video. So the first thing you can do is find your MP's contact information. You can go to ourcommons.ca/members, and that's where you just type your postal code in, you'll get your MP's contact information. then schedule a meeting. We're recommending you schedule a meeting between May and September. Then you can meet with your MP by phone or video, whatever works. And then the next would be explain to them why this is important to you. As somebody said earlier, I think maybe it was Kathryn, you don't need to be an expert. You just need to say, like, this is happening and this is important and we need to do this. We're urging you to support our petition, and this is the petition. And then we recommend following up a couple weeks later by email to ask them, so were you able to follow up on this? You know, what actions are you going to take to ensure this happens, that Canadian companies are respecting human rights overseas? And then please, we encourage you to contact us after your meeting with the MP to let us know how it went. And the fourth action point, after signing the petition, doing the social media challenge, and meeting your MP, we're going to host a virtual rally. And this is an exciting idea that I think has become more popular during the pandemic. What's great about the virtual rally compared to the normal rally is that we can all participate from across the country. So it doesn't have to be just people in Ottawa or whatever. We can all go in this rally. Here are some photos from some virtual rallies that have taken place recently about no bailouts for big oil or in support of Palestinian rights. So this is the idea of what a virtual rally is. We all come together online and you make signs and you can have a backdrop of Parliament Hill or whatever you like, and speakers and a Twitter storm. And so that we are planning for the fall, and we hope that you will join us there so that we can keep the pressure on. That will be at the same time in September. So in September, our parliamentary petition will be tabled in Parliament, and we will have this virtual rally and invite MPs and media to join us at the rally. And that's the end of this presentation about the action plan. You'll receive a follow-up email after the webinar that will have links to all the campaign resources that I mentioned. So if you didn't have a chance to copy them down, you will get them. And also, I think there'll be a question period now. So I'm going to leave this slide up during the questions. And these are the contact names for myself and for many of my colleagues at many other organizations of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability who are participating in this action plan and who can answer your questions. So if you're a member of any of these organizations, that's the person who you can contact to speak to someone about it. Or if you're not a member of an organization, please feel free to contact probably any of us or Emily Dwyer, the coordinator of the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Fiona. How exciting. And since we're a little bit over time right now, we really want to go directly to the MPs, but we'll be able to have our question period at the end. And I hope that people will be able to join with us and stay with us throughout the webinar because now we're going to be hearing from 3 members of Parliament who are with us this evening. We have with us Heather McPherson, Elizabeth May, and Nate Erskine-Smith. We have asked them a few questions. And the first one is, do they agree that the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise should be empowered to become an independent office with robust powers to investigate, including the power to compel documents and testimony? And do they also agree that Canada needs comprehensive mandatory human rights due diligence legislation in Canada? And we'd love to hear how they would advance these measures if they do agree. We also want to know what Canadians can do to support Parliament in making these measures a reality. Do they have advice for us about how we can support them and ensure that this moves forward more quickly than before? So we'll begin with Heather McPherson. She is actually sponsoring the e-petition that we're launching today. And she's the NDP MP for Edmonton-Strathcona. And before being elected to Parliament, she was the Executive Director of the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation. And she worked for Canada World Youth. So she knows these issues very, very well. I'd like to introduce Heather McPherson.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of the event today. I'm so delighted to be here. I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to sponsor this petition. It's very, very important to me. As as was mentioned, I have spent my career working in international development, in sustainable development, and I have worked a lot on the issue of making our Canadian mining corporations, or Canadian mining corporations, accountable. And so this for me just feels so wonderful. This is why I decided to get into politics. This is making the change that I really want to be a part of. And I want to thank all of the people that are on this call, but mostly all of those people who work so tirelessly on this. I feel that deep betrayal that you feel when we were promised an ombudsman, and the ombudsman that we got was not what we had asked for, and certainly not what we had been promised. So I absolutely want to continue to work with you and continue to support the work that you're doing in whatever way I can as parliamentarian. I will say that as an international development actor, I have had the great privilege of traveling around the world, and I have seen some of those examples of where Canadian mining companies have decimated local communities. I was reflecting today of a community in Nicaragua that I visited with an organization called Change for Children, where I spoke to mothers who knew that they were giving their children poisoned water, and there was nothing they could do about it. They had no options. And what a difficult thing that was for me, who is a mother, to hear. To hear that there is a mining company that has poisoned 9 aquifers in Nicaragua is absurd. One of the things that I found even more shocking was that the mining company, the Canadian mining company, bumped up on our Canadian international development projects that were digging wells. So in fact, even the efforts we are making with regards to our overseas development assistance was producing poisoned water, because we had allowed our mining companies to go in and completely decimate this community and their ability to provide clean drinking water for their families. So I certainly know this information inside and out. It's something I'm very, very keen to bring legislation forward on. It's something I'm very interested in bringing up. I am a sitting member of the International Human Rights Committee, so we will be talking about this when we are back in Ottawa, and that committee does meet again, or that subcommittee does meet again. And I want you to actually think of me a bit as your champion in this. I want to be the person bringing this forward, and I'm keen to work with any other parliamentarians that will work on this issue. So one of the things that I know you're asking about is how you can engage parliamentarians. Well, I can tell you that parliamentarians within the NDP party are on your side. We are very supportive. When you meet with your MPs, you will hear that from them. They are well versed in this topic. They know very much about what's at stake here. Paul Dwyer, one of my favorite past MPs, who unfortunately has passed away, was a huge advocate for this work and for the importance of making sure that Canadian companies abroad are held to the same responsibility as they are when they are in Canada. So you'll see that from our MPs. But I'm happy to work with MPs from across the aisle. I'm happy to work with anyone who is willing to move this forward and is willing to fight with me to make sure that we get an ombudsman that actually has the teeth to do the job, that can compel, that can work. And I encourage all of you, of course, to sign the petition. I will be making it a weekly post for the entire time until we table it in the House, to share stories of what Canadian mining companies have done abroad, and the harm that's been caused to our international reputation, to communities, to Indigenous groups, to women. So I will be making it a personal campaign for myself, and I certainly hope that you will reach out to me if you have any suggestions, any questions, any comments, anything I can do to help amplify this important issue in Parliament.
Thank you so much for your support, Heather. Now I'd like to introduce Elizabeth May. She was the first Green Party MP in Parliament, and now she's not alone. She has two other members in Parliament. She represents Saanich-Gulf Islands in British Columbia. She's very well known as an environmentalist, as a writer, an activist, and a lawyer who's been working for decades for the environment and human rights. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Heather, we now do these Zoom meetings, and it's inevitable that you start out and you forget to unmute yourself. But it's great to be with you. And of course, way before I was ever in politics, like Heather, I have a long history in civil society movements, particularly with Sierra Club and Cultural Survival and other groups working for human rights. The work that we're doing is essentially, I think, very nonpartisan. I love what Fiona just unveiled in terms of the plans around the petition for legislation for human rights and due diligence. I think that's an important campaign. One tactical idea I'll just share now, and Heather may agree, but when we do an electronic petition, you only get one chance to present, and you can have like thousands of names on that one petition. We may want to also think of having the same petition or with slightly different wording that's a paper petition, because with those, you can, as soon as you get 25 names, you can have an MP present it, and you can send it to different MPs and get each of them to present it so that it becomes more of a topic and people begin to sense a momentum around it. So I'd love to work on that. I certainly want to acknowledge, I was scanning through the names of participants to this call. I think it's a real tribute to Sherry Meyerhofer that as the Canadian Ombudsman for Responsible Enterprise, she's on this call on our Zoom meeting, knowing that we are there to push for her to have some tools, because right now there aren't any. So absolutely, to answer your first question, all the Greens support having powers of investigation, powers to compel, making sure that the Ombudsman for Responsible Enterprise has some powers to actually deal with the transgressions of Canadian mining companies and other Canadian operators. It's mostly the mining companies, but overseas, we want to make sure that they make us proud as Canadians and not ashamed, as has been so often the case. I want to mention a few things that have happened in pandemic. I mean, we've certainly heard from Cristina the horrors, and from around the world, the horrors of where basic inequities have been made worse, human rights conditions have been made worse. Oh, there's a note from Sherry. Due to pandemic, things have been made worse. On the other hand, there's some glimmers for how we might remake the world. And one thing I want to share is I think after this, and whatever the after looks like, neoliberalism is over. The idea that cropped up in the late 80s that we were going to be, you know, that corporations were inevitably and invariably the right choice, that government should be smaller, that we should deregulate, that we should have, you know, liberated trade, and all of these notions of neoliberalism essentially said government doesn't help us, government's not our friend, government's just picking your pocket. Well, right now, all around the world, we are experiencing what it looks like when governments act, not everywhere, obviously not Bolsonaro in Brazil, but generally we're looking at countries where governments haven't moved mountains in a really long time to protect human life. They've been about improving corporate profits. I think I won't go on at length about this. There's not much time for all of us to share, but we've seen the shift. I don't think we'll go back to the idea that we all owe our health and well-being to the billionaire class. We know the people to whom we owe our lives, the frontline workers who are not being paid adequately, and all around the world. I think there's a shift, and I don't think we can allow it to go back. So we have to hang on to that ground and say, right, we have to properly regulate corporations, we have to protect human rights, we have to protect the most marginalized, we have to protect Indigenous rights. I think that shift can become a permanent one. At least that's what I hope. So we'll work on this whenever, well, we can work on it right away. We can already be presenting petitions in virtual Parliament. I mean, I know this one won't be ready for a while, but we can definitely raise these issues. I raised them before the 2019 election repeatedly with Jim Carr first waiting, where is the promised position? And then when the promised position was announced, I was on my feet first to say, why does this position not have any tools or any powers that must be filled in? And that's something that we will continue to do as Greens and working as collaboratively as possible. I'm sure we have support. Obviously, you've heard we have support from the NDP. I'm sure we have support from the Bloc Québécois. And I know a lot of Liberal backbenchers are going to be there to support us on that, which is a perfect segue, I suppose, to your next speaker, because I don't know for sure what he's going to say, but I rather suspect he's on board. So stay in touch. Oh, by the way to reach every MP, let's break the code. When you go to the websites, that'll have firstname.lastname.parl.gc.ca. To reach most of us, like 90% of us personally, just insert a small letter P and the numeral 9, and that goes directly to an MP's personal website. I'll enter it in the chat so you don't have to worry that you missed it. Thanks.
Thanks for breaking the code, Elizabeth, and making democracy truly accessible to all of us. So now I have the pleasure to introduce Nathaniel Erskine-Smith. He's a Liberal MP for the riding of Beaches East York in Toronto. He was elected to Parliament in 2015, and before that he was a practicing lawyer. He studied law at Oxford and at Queen's. So I will hand it over to you, Nate.
You can hear me? My camera is not working for whatever reason, so you might just have to live with my voice.
We can hear you.
Perfect. So a few different things to say. I remember in January of 2018 thinking this was an incredibly important promise, and seeing everyone on stage with then Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne, thinking this is great to see this move forward with everyone on board together. And it, unfortunately, that camaraderie didn't last, because fast forward to the fall of 2019 and no serious action had been taken, and then jammed close to an election, very frustratingly, the government turned to an OIC to create the Corps. And while much of that OIC is incredibly important and the objectives are laudable, we know that without strong enforcement powers, without the ability to order production of papers as one example, without the ability to penalize companies who have broken the law and violated human rights, without the ability to ensure witnesses answer questions and that their testimony is compelled, we are going to have the ombudsperson is just not going to be as effective in pursuit of defending human rights. And so I hope in this parliament that we will see, and I've certainly in the last parliament called on the minister, the then Minister Carr, to do just this, but we need to see legislation that empowers this office, that formally creates this office through legislation that is debated on the House floor, and that gives this office the tools that it needs. We know when we see, I as a parliamentarian in the last parliament and into this parliament have been vocal in pursuit of protecting privacy, and we've seen a conversation about giving the privacy commissioner greater powers, because that the ombuds model has been ineffective, because we've seen big tech companies not voluntarily comply with what we might expect to protect our privacy. And so similarly, can we reasonably expect large international companies that have a history of disregarding human rights, can we expect them to voluntarily cooperate with an ombudsperson that is tasked with scrutinizing their conduct? I think the answer, and history has made this clear in all sorts of different contexts, the answer is no. And we see in the Canadian context, we shouldn't be shy about strong enforcement bodies. We see the Competition Commissioner through the Competition Bureau have significant enforcement powers. We see the Election Commissioner have significant powers. We should not be shy about having incredibly strong enforcement bodies that are there to protect our values. And we can't allow the violation of human rights in the end to be simply the cost of doing business. So I'm happy to answer other questions, but I think I hope to work alongside colleagues from other parties and colleagues from my own party to make sure we can strengthen this office and build on some of the positive work in the last Parliament.
Thank you so much, Nate, for that commitment. Now we have many, many questions for you all, for our panelists. Maybe we'll kick off with the first question that was submitted. So if the current core office was to be scored on standard effectiveness criteria for ombuds offices, how would the scores shake out? Would they fail those criteria? So, she's asking just about how it compares to other ombudsperson's offices and how we can make it effective. And perhaps, Emily, you could answer that question?
Sure, yes. I mean, the CNCA, before producing model legislation, we undertook years of research and outreach and investigation, discussion with leading practitioners, et cetera, and looked at the standard practices, the standard powers and structures of ombudsperson's offices in Canada. Defining features of federal ombudsperson's offices are independence and power to investigate. Ombudsperson's offices often have the power to seize documents, to enter for search and seizure. There's even more robust than what had originally been committed to with the core. The other piece to talk about in terms of standard effectiveness is all of the other elements that I talked about earlier of an effective ombudsperson's office: public reporting, ability to make tailored recommendations for remedy and prevention of harm, to do monitoring and follow-up. All of those depend on having robust investigations having occurred. It is the thing that the crux of it. So in our view, the ombudsperson's office fails. It has been shown with previous offices that didn't have power to investigate, that they can't serve impacted communities, that it will be a waste of time and resources and won't make them better off.
Thank you, Emily. Joe Gunn asks the question, I think this question is also for you, Emily. We've been trying to get a useful ombudsperson for over a decade, and several governments have opposed it. And the mining lobby has also proven that they are capable of opposing it. Is it time to use Canadian courts, a mining company's worst nightmare, and include governments in legal actions? Would that prove more useful to our partners, the communities that are affected by the activities of Canadian mining and garment companies?
So thank you, Elena and Joe. We have always been advocating for the need for both effective judicial and non-judicial mechanisms in Canada. People should be able, who are impacted by Canadian corporations, should be able to access both Canadian courts and an effective ombudsperson's office. So it's not an if-or. There are reasons why people would choose to go to a non-judicial mechanism over the courts. There's more discretion. There can be more of a role for those who have been impacted to craft the kind of remedy. It can help address things that don't rise to the level of what could be able to go into a court. It can be faster, etc. The other piece around access to courts and using the courts is that people have also been doing that alongside the campaigns for an ombudsperson. There are several court cases that are making their way and progressing. There was recently a very important case that went to the Supreme Court of Canada that talked about the Nevs and involving Nevs and resources in Eritrea. That is a case that has been going on for years. It's very important, extremely precedent setting, but it's still years away from getting to a resolution for impacted communities. So extremely important to be able to access courts. Extremely important for people to continue to be using the mechanism that most will be supportive of their needs, There are still many barriers to accessing courts, but we need to be able to have both courts and an effective ombudsperson. And due diligence legislation is also partly tied to ensuring that there are clear obligations on Canadian corporations so that people who are impacted can access Canadian courts to hold companies accountable if they're failing to undertake due diligence.
Thank you, Emily. We have a question maybe for the MPs on the call from Manaus Karawala. One often hears it argued that Canadian and other Western multinational companies are creating jobs and economic opportunities abroad. How do the panelists feel about this? We could start with Elizabeth. You seem ready.
Yeah, it's what we're told and the reality are often very, very different. I'll never forget, for instance, looking at the investments. For a long time I was involved with the Ogoni people fighting Shell in Nigeria, and you could look at the per capita income of Nigeria, all the money that went in, all of Shell's investment, and the per capita income of the average Nigerian continued to fall. Of course, the Abacha regime was stowing the money in offshore bank accounts. So it's not the case that this is about creating jobs and assisting local people. These are corporations that want they want the best return on investment they can get, and if they're not held to human rights standards, they will abuse human rights.
Heather,
I can jump in if you'd like. So I totally agree with what Elizabeth is saying. These aren't good jobs. These aren't family sustaining jobs. These aren't good jobs that they're bringing forward. And frankly, you know, I've spoken to people in these communities. They don't want jobs that ruin their communities. They don't want jobs that poison their families. They don't want jobs that make their environment unlivable. So it's totally washing over the actual reality when you hear those things. That doesn't make sense at all. And frankly, when you have people being murdered, like murdered by, in effect, Canadian companies, I think a job's a pretty weak argument to put forward as justification.
I mean, I would just add, creating jobs around the world is incredibly important, but at what cost? I mean, if we look domestically, we wouldn't say, well, you know what, this company that ignored our regulations and ignored our human rights standards, well, we'll give them a pass because they created a few jobs. That simply does not pass the test. And so I do not understand the rationale that would suggest what is unacceptable in our country is somehow acceptable elsewhere around the world.
I just want to jump in really quickly as a hot pursuit and say that in Canada it happens as well. I mean, I'm living in a province right now where meat packers their lives are being put at risk every day because of corporate greed. So, you know, as much as we'd like to think it's not a problem here, it is.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Heather, and Nate, for answering that. We have a few questions about what's the best way for youth to get involved and engage in these conversations and this work, especially among youth. So peer, engagement. That could be open to anyone, any of the panelists.
I just jump in quickly as probably the oldest panelist to say that young people are incredibly effective. And I would urge anyone who wants to be involved to follow all the steps that were just in Fiona's list. Talk to your MPs, organize petitions, ask to be involved, and also writing. I think in pandemic, in a weird way, our conventional media, like the daily newspapers, are getting more people reading them than when we weren't in pandemic. So expressing concerns about long-term justice issues coming from young people. You can either identify yourself as a young person as you write your letter or not, but your voices do count, and mobilize as much as you possibly can so that when we're post-pandemic, people say, even in pandemic, we were hearing from young people that they're concerned about the abuse of human rights by Canadian companies around the world.
I would just add, I mean, there are so many different ways for any individual to get involved, including young people, but young people should first be organizing among their peers. And I certainly, as someone who was raised vegetarian, I became vegan in grade 8 as an example alongside classmates, and it was because we were having these kinds of conversations. So don't shy away from those kinds of conversations with your friends and classmates. And secondly, get involved in a broader way, and that could mean starting a campus club of some sort or a school club of some sort, but it could also mean setting up a meeting with your MP. And yes, young people meeting with individual MPs can be incredibly effective. And beyond that, get involved. I have a youth council as an example in my riding that has 20 some odd kids every month. When we just had a recent one on Zoom, and otherwise in person outside of this pandemic. And that's a good way to raise issues and put them on the radar of a member of parliament. And also, if people do care about getting involved in campaigns will mean you are that much more of an effective advocate with a member of parliament down the road. So don't shy away from people. Young people tend to shy away from more partisan involvement, but I would say if you really care about an issue, that can in some cases be the most effective way of driving that issue forward.
Yeah. No, and I'll just do a really quick intervention, but basically what we've always said is that, you know, I used to work with Canada World Youth. I've worked with youth organizations. We actually took 5 Alberta youth to Nicaragua to see the situation with Canadian mining companies. And I would say that we use a format of learn, share, act. Learn more about the issue, make sure you're sharing it with your cohort, make sure you're sharing it with people that you know, and then choose those things that you want to take action on and do it. Parliamentarians are eager to listen to young people, are eager to have those conversations. If anyone ever needs any suggestions or any advice on how to engage with your parliamentarian, I'm sure Nate, Elizabeth, and myself, we're all completely open to that, and many parliamentarians would be.
Yeah, earlier in the session, Kathryn made the point that people sometimes think that they're afraid to go. I was actually amazed that anyone would think this, Kathryn, that people might not want to go talk to their MP for fear that their MP would be so much more knowledgeable and they wouldn't know enough to go talk to them. So I can see, you guys are both laughing. Believe me, most constituents going to talk to their MP about an issue that you really care about, you know way more than the MP knows, and it's our job to work for you, right? That's the job. It's a really hard to contact employer because it's, for most of us, about 100,000 people at least, but that's our employer. So when you come to meet with us, we're just doing our job to listen and do what you want us to do. So don't be intimidated around that. It's not hard to talk to your MP. And you know, I think
now you don't even have to leave your bedroom to do it.
Even the hard ones to like, you can try hard and talk to them.
We're going to have to wrap up there. It's been such a rich discussion. It's been a thrill to be able to hear Cristina directly from the Philippines, where it's, you know, she got up there at the crack of dawn, 12 hours later than us, to join us. And the human rights and environmental defenders around the world who are struggling and through this pandemic, just as we are, but also are facing so many urgent human rights issues. Yeah, so a big thanks also to the MPs, to Fiona from Amnesty, from Emily from the CNCA. I'm Elana Wright from Development and Peace, and we are so glad that over 230 activists, members of our organizations, concerned Canadians were able to join us tonight for this webinar. So thank you again, and you'll receive a follow-up email with the recording and all of the resources. So thank you so much and have a great night.